I'd like to buy the world a home and furnish it with love. Grow apple trees and honey bees and snow white turtle doves. I like to teach the world to sing with me. Perfect harmony, perfect harmony. I like to buy the world a home and keep it company.
Welcome to everybody. Today we're going to talk about I'm not going to talk about anything. I can get this turned on. There we go. Got to fiddle with enough buttons here. Okay. Still not getting. Hey, there we go. Today we're going to talk about advertising. Okay. I want to start with this question. What do companies make? I mean, that seemed like a silly question, I know, but nevertheless, do they make shoes? Cars? Do they make houses? Clothes? Well, here's the real secret. They only make those things if they have to. A firm's most important product is desire. The most important product is you. And I mean that in a very real sense. The customer must be remade in the image and likeness of the product. So, today we're going to look at how this came about and what kind of dilemmas it presents us. We'll be looking at it from two standpoints: the biological imperative and the post-modern response. All right. Now, this really is new, something that happened in about the last 100 years or so, and it really is an imperative. What do I mean? Well, we went to capital-intensive, specialized machinery for manufacturing with high retooling costs. It could not easily be switched to new product lines. That is to say, production could not respond to demand, so demand had to be created to respond to production. So you had very, very high capital costs, but very, very low unit costs. So basically, the first unit costs you, $100 million, and the second unit costs you $1. In order to pay off those high capital costs, you have to produce in very high volumes. But markets quickly become saturated. So two problems: competition and a shortage of demand. Competition. Now remember, there's two kinds. There's game-like and warlike. One is rule-bound, unending, and there are no losers. Warlike, and it's based in cooperation. Warlike competition, well, all is fair. And it's meant to terminate. It's meant to destroy the opposition. So there are real losers. And this fosters not cooperation, but enmity. Well, here's the problem. When each company can saturate the market from its own production, overproduction leads to bankruptcy. Competition becomes warlike. And it leads to consolidation, which leads to economic oligarchy. And that's the end of the free market. Well, you have saturated markets. You've made enough for everybody. So what happens then? You cannot survive on replacement or on population growth. You've got too much invested. Solution called planned obsolescence. Let things wear out faster or release improvements slowly so that customers must always be rebuying what they already own. So it was defined as instilling in the buyer the desire to own something a little newer, a little better, a little sooner than necessary. Brooks Stevens, 1854, one of the engineers who helped create this. Well, this leads to the primacy of advertising because it's necessary to instill desire for ever new things. So marketing, not production or design, becomes the strategic function. Nor was it necessary to design products to last. So you designed for the shortest length of time that consumers can be conditioned to accept. It is the systematic attempt of business to make us wasteful, debt-ridden, permanently discontented individuals. Vance Packard, The Wastemakers, 1960. It's the biological imperative, because without such compulsive consumption, our industrial production system could not survive. Markets would quickly be saturated and demand would dry up. Advertising, now understood not as persuasion, but as the creation of desire, becomes the linchpin of the entire system. This leads to what Soren Kucherai has called cultural Alzheimer's. You must keep rebuying what you already own, which means you must forget what you own, which also involves forgetting who you are. And this leads to a constant poverty in the midst of plenty. Since desire is the product, companies no longer make useful things. They make brands. Actual production is outsourced. Let me give you an example. Nike. You're all familiar with Nike. Nike makes no products. There is not a single factory in the world that turns out Nike product. Nike makes the swoosh. And this swooshtica blesses all that it touches. Bless you. So, to summarize this, the possibility of overproduction leads to the biological imperative, which leads to the necessity to create desire. Hence, the primacy of advertising over production, engineering, distribution, whatever. All right, so that establishes the need. What's the response to this? Well, businesses found the perfect response in postmodernism. So let's start with looking at postmodernism, and we'll start with the philosophic basis, the psychological basis, the invasion of the psyche, and how do we deprogram ourselves. Right, the philosophic basis. We'll talk about modernism and postmodernism. Modernism. Modernism, let's define it as resting on three propositions. One, rationalism and the rejection of all authorities, especially religious authority, radical individualism and the triumph of self-interest, and scientism, or the cult of the expert. Now, taken together, they form what's called a meta-narrative, and we'll return to that term in just. So, we live, according to this meta-narrative, we live in a material world which a purely objective science can explain, given enough time and funding. Science, therefore, becomes the meta-narrative capable of rendering judgment on every other account of the world. So, materialism, rationalism, individualism. That's modernism. Well, what's postmodernism? It depends on some rather startling claims. The first comes from Jacques Derrida. There is nothing outside the text. The second comes from Michel Foucault. Power is knowledge. And the third is politics precedes being, Gilles Deleuze. And the fourth, four statements, a suspicion of all meta-narratives, Jean-François Lyotard. Okay, these sound rather strange, don't they? Let's take the first one. There is nothing outside the text, Jacques Derrida. Well, this is not as strange as it seems, because all knowledge is in fact mediated through language. So, and language is a social construct, and hence can be deconstructed. Now, there's lots and lots of debates over what deconstruction means, but nevertheless, if it's constructed, it certainly can be deconstructed. Power is knowledge. Well, that's sort of the reverse of everything you were taught. But what this claim is that what counts as knowledge is shaped within networks of political, social, and economic power. So individuals do not create society. Society creates the individual and does so for its own purposes. Okay, what counts as knowledge is shaped within political, social, and economic power. Just a side note here, I'm looking at this COVID debate, this vaccine debate, and I'm seeing an awful lot of suspicion on the part of people that power is knowledge. All the authorities that are telling them to get vaccinated or wear masks or whatever it might be, it seems to me that Foucault is working his way sort of into just the general consciousness, and that people are suspicious, and not totally unreasonable for them to be suspicious. I think Foucault is right. What you can get published in the journals, is not always purely objective. Okay. Politics precedes being. Now, this is kind of a large metaphysical statement that seems to make no sense. However, think about this. Your being is preceded by politics. Namely, had your father not been politic with your mother, about 9 months before you were born, then you would not be here. But what this also means is that there is no philosophy that is not already embedded in politics, and they all arise in a particular setting. And they're all a response to particular questions that society, that culture raises. And it's rooted in desire. But this desire is socially created. I mean, what you desire is what you've learned to desire. You've learned to know what is beautiful and what is not. You've learned to know what is more valuable in this society and what is less valuable in society, etc., etc. And so, to that extent, your desires are culturally and politically formed. All right, a suspicion of meta-narratives. Now, the meta-narrative is an explanation of everything. Can be called a myth. Now, we already looked at this in our second lecture when we compared the Christian narrative with the materialist narrative. Both narratives purported to give a universal explanation. We think everything is logical, but it's not. Jesus gives us not a summa, but a biography that sort of combines mythos, that is a story, explanation of everything, and a logos. And in this sense, Jesus is a unique religious figure in that he combines both in himself. But in Lealtad, science is no less a narrative than religion. And all knowledge has to be grounded in faith or myth, whether it's the myth of an all-knowing science or the myth of an all-knowing God. Now, myth here doesn't mean lie. It just means a story which makes sense of everything. All right, the results. These propositions do undermine the liberal world order. And they point to the fact that social reality is not something objective, it's created. Now, in this system, free choice is an illusion, at least an absolutely free choice. It's not a denial of free will entirely, but it is a recognition that choice is highly, highly conditioned, unless you spend a lifetime sort of unconditioning yourself. People, it asserts, are socially created to serve the needs of those in power. Now, there's kind of two sides to postmodernism, and I'll start with the light side. It does allow for a very sophisticated critique of modernism, and it establishes religious truth on an equal basis with modern scientific truth. That is, neither can any longer claim to be, absolute. And they have to contend not as objective facts, but as competing narratives. Now, radical orthodoxy is an example of postmodernism applied to Orthodox Christianity. So there's a whole school of thought of theology that is postmodern and reaffirms. However, this postmodernism has a dark side, and it's very dark indeed. Postmodernism rejects modern notions of objective truth. But then it kind of negates itself because it seems to regard these modern notions as the only possible notion of truth. So it ends up in radical nihilism. So meaning is not inherent in things, it's assigned. So advertising on the dark side. This dark side postmodernism provides the necessary rationalization for advertising to serve the biological imperative. You can create a hyper-reality. And since things have no inherent meaning, they must be assigned meanings. So you can train the consumer to assign certain meanings to products. This also then, this process has a psychological basis. And it really starts with Sigmund Freud. Let's talk about Freud and propaganda. All right. I want to start here with Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays, 1891 to 1995. He was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and Freud is largely known in English because Bernays sponsored the translation of his work from German into English. But Bernays was also the first person to apply Freudian psychology to advertising in this little book, Propaganda, the Public Mind in the Making. Now, isn't that a wonderful subtitle? Don't you just love that? Bernays' method was simply this: to associate a product or an issue with some subconscious desire. This he called the engineering of desire. Now, soon after he published his work on propaganda, the thing was adopted by the Nazis and by the fascists as sort of one of their founding texts. So Bernays changed the name to public religion. But it still means the same thing as Bernays' propaganda. It was from Bernays that we get the idea of the deep state. And what he meant by the deep state is there has to be a core, an elite of people with enough money and resources to form the public opinion. Well, that could not be left to the public. That had to be handled by this wealthy elite. Now, Bernays worked for every president from Woodrow Wilson to Ronald Reagan. Now, in politics, this engineering was called the engineering of consent. In commerce, it was called the engineering of desire. But either way, the public had to be engineered. Here's a great example. So, why do women smoke? Well, women don't smoke anymore because not that many people smoke. But when I was attending the UD in the 70s, everybody smoked. They smoked in the classrooms. There was ashtrays on all the desks. And women smoked in only slightly lower numbers than men did. Well, this turns out to be the result of a propaganda campaign, because at the turn of the 20th century, most women did not smoke. They wouldn't smoke a cigarette any more than today they would smoke cigars. How did this come about? Take a look.
Information, they would look at their work.
Bernays set out to experiment with the minds of the popular classes. His most dramatic experiment was to persuade women to smoke. At that time, there was a taboo against women smoking, and one of his early clients, George Hill, the president of the American Tobacco Corporation, asked Bernays to find a way of breaking it.
He said, we're losing half of our market because men have invoked a taboo against women smoking in public. Can you do anything about that? I said, let me think about it. And then I said, have I your permission to see a psychoanalyst to find out what cigarettes mean to women? He said, what'll it cost? So I called up Dr. Brill, A.A. Brill, who was a leading psychoanalyst in New York at that time.
How come you didn't call your uncle? Why didn't you call your uncle?
Because he was in Vienna.
A.A. Brill was one of the first psychoanalysts in America, and for a large fee he told Bernays that cigarettes were a symbol of the penis and of male sexual power. He told Bernays that if he could find a way to connect cigarettes with the idea of challenging male power, then women would smoke, because then they would have their own penises. Every year, New York held an Easter Day parade to which thousands came, and Bernays decided to stage an event there. He persuaded a group of rich debutantes to hide cigarettes under their clothes. Then they should join the parade, and at a given signal from him, they were to light up the cigarettes dramatically. Bernays then informed the press that he had heard that a group of suffragettes were preparing to protest by lighting up what they called torches of freedom.
He knew this would be an outcry, and he knew that all of the photographers would be there to capture this moment. And so he was ready with a phrase, which was torches of freedom. And so here you have a symbol, women, young women, debutantes, smoking a cigarette in public with a phrase that means anybody who believes in this kind of equality pretty much has to support them in the ensuing debate about this, because torches of freedom. I mean, what's on all American coins? It's liberty. She's holding up the torch, you see? And so all of this is there together. There's emotion, there's memory, there's a rational phrase, even though it's using a lot of emotional elements. It's a phrase that works in a rational sense. All of this is together. And so the next day, this was not just in all of the New York papers, it was across the United States and around the world. And from that point forward, the sale of cigarettes to women began to rise. He had made them socially acceptable with a single symbolic act.
What Bernays had created was the idea that if a woman smoked, it made her more powerful and independent, an idea that still persists today.
Okay, isn't that marvelous? Look what happened there. You took a product and you associated it with equality, freedom. You took cigarettes, associated it with freedom. Now the association is absolute nonsense. Cigarettes don't represent freedom, they represent a kind of slavery. I know, I smoked 60 years. For 50 years, I'm sorry. And I still have to vape nicotine. So, to say it was freedom is logically nonsense. But at a psychological level, this worked. So, let's look at a more modern example of this and see just what the kind of things they get away with. Look at this commercial and tell me what you see. Okay. Did you see anything about sandwiches in that commercial? I mean, they showed pictures of sandwiches, but they made a connection, the same connection that Bernays made with cigarettes. They made a connection between the sandwich and freedom. And of course, you have to look at all the images there. You have to look at the music. Notice there was young, attractive people doing interesting, exciting things. And this is connected with the sandwich. That's how it works. And, sad to say, it does work. And never think that it doesn't. All right, what you see here is an invasion of the human psyche. One that moves us from citizen to consumer. It's a creation of reality, because if According to postmodernism, there is no objective reality, and there is only this hyper reality which we create. So you are what you buy. The goal? We must shift America from a needs to a desires culture. People must be trained to desire, to want new things, even before the old had been entirely consumed. We must shape a new mentality. Man's desires must overshadow his needs. Paul Mazar, chairman of the Lehman Brothers, one of the premier investment firms, or it was until it went bankrupt in 2000. So this was a deliberate business strategy. The method, hyperreality. Remember, there's no real reality. There's a created reality, a hyperreality. So you identify intangible desire with a saleable commodity. Cigarettes and women's empowerment, sandwiches and freedom. Or this motto, Coke is the real thing. Now, that was the Coke's model for 20 or motto for 20 or 30 years. And I think they used it to produce what I think is sort of the perfect advertisement. And it's really worth looking at. Okay, so look at this. This is from 1972. Now you have to understand what was going on in the Vietnam War was still active, but was winding down. And so peace was, of course, a very big issue. So let's look at this commercial. And let's see if we can figure out what's going on.
I'd like to buy the world a home and furnish it with love. Grow apple trees and honey bees and snow white turtle doves. I like to teach the world to sing. Sing with me. Perfect harmony. Perfect harmony. I like to buy the world a Coke and keep it company. It's the real I like to teach the world to sing. In perfect harmony. Perfectly. And I'd like to buy the world a Coke and keep it company. It's the real thing. What the world wants today is the real thing. What the world wants today is the real thing.
Wasn't that just marvelous? But did you notice what was going on in this? I want to go over this again, just a little bit slower here, and see if we can figure out precisely what's happening.
I'd like to buy
Look,
the
so we start.
world a home.
Okay. Whoops.
I'd like to buy the world a home and
Okay. We start with a tight shot of this blonde-haired, blue-eyed, attractive young lady. See where we go from there.
furnish it with
Now
love.
watch the camera pull
Grow
out.
apple trees and
And now we see we got a red head
snow
in
white
here.
turtle
Okay.
doves. I like to teach the world.
Okay, we're going down the row now. And we can see Scandinavian here, we can see African, we can see Indian here. You see? So you see the message that's being delivered.
To sing with me.
Think about the words here. I'd like to buy the world a Coke, apple trees and honey bees and snow white turtle doves. Well, how could you be opposed? And you see how we stop here, stop right here, and tell me what you see. Tell me what you see. Remember, this is 1972. There are still millions of veterans from World War II, millions of veterans from the Korean War, and millions of veterans from Vietnam. What do you see there? Well, what you're seeing is a replacement military formation. Instead of soldiers carrying guns, you have these soldiers of peace. Instead of soldiers from one country, you have these international soldiers, and their weapon is, the position that they're standing at, by the way, is called present arms. And the weapon they're holding is not a rifle, it's Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola as the weapon of peace. Look at that. Look at that face. This is a face of a woman in some sort of intense passion. You know? It might be the face of someone praying to the Virgin Mary. But here she's praying to Coke. And here we come back and we can see the whole world coming together. Okay. And finally, the real message. Coke is the real thing. Not all those things you were taught about that were real. Coke is the real thing. A few more comments. The music. The music is on the pentatonic scale. That is the 5 black notes on the piano. Right? That's the most universal musical scale. Each word has 1 note, except for the word real, where they give it 2 syllables. This song, quite apart from the commercial, became a top 40 hit song. So in other words, they were carrying the ad for free. Now there's, I think, the perfect example of creating a hyper reality. The object of all of this is to change us from being citizens. By a citizen, I mean one who takes responsibility for himself or herself, for his family, for his community, and for his country, and to turn us into a consumer. One whose identity is derived from what he or she purchases. So, what do we do about it? Well, I think we need to deprogram ourselves. And before we can deprogram ourselves, we have to admit to ourselves that we have been programmed. All right, deconstructing the anti-literature. And why am I calling this an anti-literature? Think about art, literature, and the human person. Art and literature has always shaped the human person. That's not new. But it always sought to work at both the intellectual and the emotive levels. And art helped us to discern meaning and purpose in the world. But this meaning was not considered to be something arbitrary. It was something discovered. It was something inherent in being. And this art demanded our full attention, intellectual and emotive. So, when Homer recited his poem, he wanted your full attention. He wanted your full intellect. He wanted your full heart. He wanted your full being. He wanted you to bring all of that to listening. And that's what every artist wants. But advertising is an anti-literature. Now, advertisers employ the best artists. Probably any artist who's making a living today has probably worked for advertisers in one way or another. But the object is not to engage the mind, but to bypass it. They want you to say, oh, that's just a commercial. That doesn't affect me. But unlike art, and this is what really makes it an anti-literature, unlike art, it assigns meaning to things. The cigarette is a sign of woman's freedom. The sandwich is a sign of your personal autonomy. That's a Coca-Cola is world peace. You see, obviously, logically, none of these products are associated with these things, but the meaning is now assigned, not inherent in the product. Because meaning is arbitrary. So the object is not to build up the soul, but to tear it down. So how do we deprogram it? Well, we could say, just turn the ads off. One, that's not the best strategy, and I don't even think it's a possible strategy. I think the proper strategy is to do the opposite. Watch them, but now watch them with your full mind. So all of those things you learned in 4 semesters of literary criticism, use them. Look at what kind of images they're presenting. Look at what kind of associations they're making. Look at the music. Look at the symbols. And analyze them as you would analyze all of the literature you spent 2 years analyzing. So try to construct the logical argument. Now, there always is a logical argument, even if it's not very logical. So cigarettes bring freedom. Okay. Once you can state that logical argument, you can see how illogical it is. So note the images, colors, ages of the actors, types of music, etc. Then try to reconstruct the emotional argument. Identify the non-marketable product selling. Could be status, could be sex, could be attractiveness, could be world peace, but there's always some non-marketable product that they are trying to associate with the product. Once you do that consciously, the ads lose their power over you. Once you see what they're actually saying, it becomes kind of a joke. I also recommend doing this. Take stock. That is, take an inventory of what you own. Try to remember what you were thinking when you bought it. Did the product that you bought actually fulfill its promise? Did it actually make your life better in the way it purported to? Or would you rather have that money back in your pocket? Now, as we'll see in the next lecture, all of this is kind of Stone Age technique to what's going on the internet with big data and the anti-social media. Because we found what we feared the surveillance state, and now we're discovering it has a corporate logo. We'll discuss that in the next. So, I think we are in a brave new world. I think it leads to some questions that we should be asking. So, what do you think? Are we formed by advertising? We don't like to think so. But when we look at what we buy, look at what you've actually bought, can you be so confident that you were not influenced by these techniques? Now look at another level. Look at politics as a product. Look at political propaganda and see whether it's not the same thing. So I look forward to hearing your discussions on this. Seeing you all next week, following the discussions on the discussion board. You have a good day.